Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. During 2021, the State Historical Society is commemorating the upcoming 175th anniversary of Iowa statehood. In the Iowa History 101 webinar series, which focuses on the past lives of Iowans, continues on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will learn about how Iowa was a turning point in George Washington Carver's life. Happenstance brought him to Iowa with here and there education, but he was a determined, educated young man when he left for Tuskegee University. We will also learn more about George Washington Carver and his connection to Iowa State University during the April 22 webinar. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Linda Griffith-Smith. Linda is a lifelong Madison County resident. Now retired from a career in information technology, she volunteers her time in various history-related Madison County organizations. Linda believes that a day well spent is researching what actually happened and any fun facts, plus engaging the skills and interests of others in Madison County history. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Linda to begin the webinar.
Thank you, Jennifer and Matt, and thank you for attending live and for those who are listening to the recording. I want to tell you how Iowa played a pivotal role in George Washington Carver's life. But we're going to start back a little bit before that, when he was first born in Missouri. As you can see on the title slide, the years he spent here were 1888 to 1896, just a portion of his long life. He was born into slavery in southeast Missouri in a small town, well, near a small town called Diamond. And he never knew his mother and father. When he was yet a baby, he and his mother were kidnapped from the Carver farm. Baby George was recovered, but the mother was not. So Moses Carver, that you see here, and his wife raised him and began educating him when he was young. He learned to work hard both inside and outside of the house and acquired many domestic skills that we'll see served him well in the years ahead. He loved to roam the fields and care for the various types of plants that he found there. And he learned to read, but he only owned a single spelling book. At age 12, he went to the nearby town of Neosha, where there was a school for Black children. He was taken in by a kindly Black couple, Andrew and Mariah Watkins, who gave him a home, saw that he attended school, and took him to church, which was always an important part of his life from then on. Here's a couple pictures that we have of him as a young man. In the left one, he's pictured with his older brother, James, and James died as a young man in his 30s. And I wanted to stop here and talk a little bit about George Carver's voice. He had so many things against him, as we'll see, but he also had a very unique voice. He suffered with a lot of whooping cough and respiratory issues when he was young, and sometimes that's attributed to why he spent so much time in the house and learned his domestic skills so well. And as he got older, it really didn't change much. It was still high and very nasally. And I'm going to play you just a 10-second clip of what his voice sounded like. He is reading a poem called Equipment. So here you go.
Figure it out for yourself, my lad. you've all that the greatest of men hath had. 2 arms, 2 hands, 2 legs, 2 eyes, and a brain to
So a
use if
very
you would be wise.
unusual voice to add to his other unusual characteristics. He went on to Kansas. He found a couple who was going to Fort Scott, and he hoped to find more education there. And he was pursuing that when he witnessed a horrible death of one of his race. And so he left and continued on his travels. To survive, he made money as a day worker. Sometimes he would cook for a household, or he would find some sort of inside domestic work. And he could always earn a little money because it costs very little to acquire a wash tub, a washboard, and a bar of soap, and clothes always needed to be laundered. In Minneapolis, Kansas, another kindly Black couple, Lucy and Christopher Seymour, helped him finish high school, which was the equivalent of our 10th grade. Here he grew to his full height. He was over 6 feet tall, and he finally looked like a man. His next adventure was at Highland College, Kansas. He wrote a letter to the college and was very excited that they accepted him to come. The college had less than 100 students, and they were of all grades, and really there was only a handful that were of the college age. So arriving at college, he was probably so excited to finally reach his goal. But he was disappointed in that the college refused to let him attend because of his color. They did accept white students, of course, and they did accept some Indian students, but they just thought it was too risky to their fundraising to accept a Black student. But some of the professors and townspeople were very upset that this happened at the college. And they found him a place to live, and he stayed there about a year, and they shared their knowledge, and he worked his way. He could survive. And one family that he became familiar with, their last name was Beeler. They had a son homesteading in Western Kansas, and Carver decided to join him there. So off he went to the newly formed Ness County, Kansas, in Western Kansas, as you can see, and he made his own homestead claim. And he built a sod house for himself. This is just a picture I found of a sod house, not particularly his. And they said it was very well decorated outside with plants. And he even built on a secondary room where he kept plants inside. He also traveled farther west than Kansas and saw his first cactus and yucca plants and succulents that he was always amazed with. But in 1888, he borrowed $300 on his homestead as collateral, and he moved on. This slide comes from his national monument in Diamond, Missouri, and it's just a good place to pause and see all of the traveling he did trying to find an education. And the blue circle in the lower part of the screen is where Diamond and Neosho are located. And I've not been to his national monument, but they say it's quite a beautiful place down there. But in 1888, as I said, he turned to Iowa and he landed in Winterset, where I'm from. He was here from 1888 to 1890. And it was a rapidly growing place. We don't know exactly why. This is the place that he landed. But the square was filled with brick buildings, and most of them are still there today. And the homes were being built, and several hotels were popular for businessmen to show their wares and for anyone to come and eat their supper. Dining rooms were a popular outing then, just as they are now. He found employment in the city hotel, and the Schultzes ran the hotel and had just built on the brick addition that you see to the right in the picture. It was 20 feet wide and 66 feet long and held a new dining room that became very popular. The Schultzes told him he had a job as long as their son, Frank, was off looking for his own work and a musical career, but that if Frank returned, Carver would lose his job. Carver recorded, "I cooked at this hotel for some time, but Frank did return and Carver did lose his job. And although this doesn't exist, it did until the 1980s. Now we have a fire station here, and next to it, there's a small pocket park called the George Washington Carver Park in Winterset. And I'll show you a picture of that later. In Winterset, here's a map of Winterset in 1875. The Schultz Hotel was just off the square, and he lived near the bottom in an area I have marked with a blue circle near the entrance of the cemetery. And he lived in a shack there and did laundry to make ends meet. The other places there, the Baptist Church and Millholland home, we'll look at next. At the First Baptist Church, he showed up the first Sunday he was in Winterset, as was his custom. He always went to a local church. He didn't particularly care what the denomination was, but he was drawn there perhaps by the singing. Here he describes what happened next. "One evening, I went to a white church and sat in the rear of the house. The next day, a handsome man called on me at the hotel and said his wife wanted to see me. When I reached their splendid residence, I was astonished to recognize her as the prima donna of the choir. I was most astonished when she told me that my fine voice had attracted her." So that's his meeting with the Mulhollins. In this 1922 description, he continued, "I had to sing quite a number of pieces for her and agree to come to her house at least once a week. And from that time until now, Mr. and Mrs. Millholland have been my warmest and most helpful friends." And the house still does exist today in Winterset. He and Helen had many interests in common, and I represented those across the bottom. They both played the piano, and they both loved to garden. And those are just pictures I picked up. The middle picture is one of Carver's paintings that you'll often see when you're reading about him. They both tended plants in a greenhouse in her yard. She gave him voice lessons, and he gave her art lessons. Here's a picture of the Millholland. He spent many days with them. They were cultured and educated, and even played Santa for their daughters when they were younger. Again in 1922, Carver wrote, "It was Mrs. Millholland's custom to have me come at the day's end and review to her the doings of the day. She would invariably laugh after such a recital and say, 'Who ever heard of any one person doing half so many things?' He grew so close to them that he was able to confide in them about his disappointment at Highland College in Kansas. So they began to talk with him about attending Simpson Art School. At first, he was opposed to the idea. It was just too much, and he'd been too disappointed. But in a moment he later described as a godly intervention, he determined that he would indeed go. And so Carver moved on to Indianola and spent 2 years there, in and out a little bit, as we'll see. Simpson College at that time consisted of 3 schools, a business school, an art school, and a music school, with 426 students and a faculty of 17. And he would be their second Black student. With his 10th grade education, he couldn't quite enroll in one of the 3 colleges there. So he enrolled instead in Simpson's preparatory program, taking courses in arithmetic, grammar, and essay writing, just as a prep school student would today. After he paid his $12 admission, he had a meager 10 cents to live on. President Edmund Holmes gave him permission to live in an abandoned shed on the edge of the campus, where he started a laundry to make ends meet. The students and faculty were kind. They used his laundry services. They supplied him with furniture, and they would slip coins under his door. He was never looking for a handout. He always wanted to work hard and make his own way. But the students liked him and they involved him in various literary, musical, and religious activities. While he was there, he asked if he could take a class outside of his curriculum. He was so very interested in art class, and the class was held in the brand new science hall you see there in the upper floor with a beautiful skylight. First year teacher, Miss Etta Budd, she was the art teacher. Whoops, I'm sorry. Let's go back there. Was very skeptical and only offered him a 2-week trial because he was so insistent. Of the 20 art students, all the rest were young women, most of them unmarried. After the 2 weeks, Etta Budd was convinced of his talents. To pay for his art class, he split wood for her. Etta Budd had a keen eye for more than art. She was not only his teacher, but became his friend, and she could see that he was struggling. So she enlisted another friend of hers, the Listons. Arthur and Sophia Liston ran the bookstore in Indianola where the students bought their books. They became fast friends. Much like Mrs. Millholland, he helped her with her painting and began to care for the flowers in her garden. He often studied in their home and became an unofficial member of their family. They became very close, and in subsequent letters throughout several decades, he addressed her in letters as mother, and she signed hers the same way. Of the kindness he received throughout his time in Indianola, he later said, "I shudder to think what might have happened if Simpson College had closed its doors. When I came, hungering and thirsting for an opportunity to develop as God gave me light and strength, they made me believe I was a real human being." That's quite a statement. He eventually took his leave of Simpson. He was beginning to feel the call to help his race. And he's a young man in his later 20s now. So we're not talking about a teenager at all. And Etta Budd felt that a life of art probably was going to be difficult to make any money at and would not help him reach that goal. So Carver wrote to Mrs. Millholland at that time, "My teacher, Etta Budd, told me the other day that she is sorry she did not find me out sooner, or she could have planned differently for me." But Etta Budd did plan differently and encouraged him that some of his other talents might serve his goal better. She introduced her father, Joseph Budd, to Carver, and Professor Budd was one of the nation's eminent botanists, and he was a professor at Iowa Agricultural College, which I will call Iowa State because I'm so used to doing that. Though Carver was very unhappy to leave the world of art, he too began to realize that he could be of greater service to his people with an agricultural background. He wanted to uplift others as he had been and to make their education a much easier road. So he moved on up to Ames in the spring of 1891 and enrolled in the undergraduate program at Iowa State. This is an early picture. For any of you familiar with Iowa State, we're looking across Central Campus to the west. Morrill Hall and the water tower are still there today. And where Beardshire now sits, they had at that time what they called Main Hall, another very large hall. The two schools were similar in their number of students. They each had less than 500, but there was one difference. Where the Simpson students were very welcoming to Carver, he found just the opposite at Iowa State. They shunned him. He was not allowed to eat in the dining room. He could serve them there if he liked, but he needed to eat in the basement with the field hands. Officials thought it best not to place him in the dormitory with the white students. He didn't even have any bedding to bring with him as the others did. Unsure what to do, Professor James Wilson stepped forward and said he could stay in his office. And that's what Carver did throughout his undergraduate time. There's an early map too, and there's team of Jim Wilson. Here's an early map of Iowa State, and I circled Moral Hall so you could get your perspective. He was very homesick for Simpson College and the love and care that he received there. So he wrote to his mother, Mrs. Liston, in Indianola that he was discouraged and wondering if it was even a good idea. As Mrs. Liston later remembered, she said, I immediately put on my best dress and house and took the train for Ames. The day she spent with him, she ate with him in the basement and she said she walked out all over the campus with Carver and stayed with him all evening. Soon after, he told her the next day everything was different. The ice was broken, and from then on, things went very much easier. So the lesson learned is never underestimate a Victorian woman dressed in her best hat and dress. To make ends meet, Carver began his life at Iowa State by working, as usual, at menial jobs. He cut wood, he cleaned barns, he took care of the chemical and botanical laboratories, and he worked as a janitor in North Hall. Due to his extreme intelligence and approachable personality, the students began to seek his help in classes. Here he's pictured with the dairy class, and he is in the back row on the right. Socially, he began to be treated just like any other student. He became involved in all kinds of student activities. He sang in chapel services, was a masseuse, or what they called a rubber, for the football team, and even played on the baseball team. He was active, as he had been in the past, in various literary societies. He took piano and voice lessons and paid for them with painting lessons. And the students really appreciated his artistic talents when it came for them to get ready for one of their socials. And then he could supply accordion or piano music at the actual event. He participated in military training in what was then called the Department of Military Science and Tactics, probably like ROTC in my day. Here he's in the front row, fourth from the left. And he became a quartermaster in this 1895 bomb yearbook picture. So he was very involved with his life as an undergraduate. But he never lost his passion for art. In December of 1892, an exhibit of paintings by Iowa artists was held in Cedar Rapids, and several encouraged Carter to enter a few of his works in the show, but he insisted that the trip would be too expensive. But a group of students whisked him away to a department store and purchased him a suit and paid for his ticket to Cedar Rapids. 4 of his paintings were picked there by judges, including this one that he had done a few years earlier in Etta Budd's class of some of the cactus he had seen when he lived in western Kansas. As a result, Carver's painting called Yucca and Cactus was selected to represent Iowa in the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. If any of you have read Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City, that's where this picture was displayed. In the winter of 1892, while Iowa State was closed, interestingly enough, the school year started in the spring and ended late in the year, and the winter they had off. During that time, Carver returned to Simpson to take more art classes from Etta Budd. Part of Carver's story at Iowa State has to do with the faculty that he ran into. They were an esteemed faculty. Iowa Agricultural College was respected for the science that it was bringing to agriculture. And these men were very welcoming to George Carver. Etta Budd's father, Joseph Budd, won distinction by proving that farms in Iowa could indeed profitably raise a variety of fruits, and he even wrote a book about raising orchards in Iowa. It was his responsibility to keep up the flower beds on campus, and Professor Budd put Carver in charge of all the greenhouses and considered him an assistant. So Carver was essentially the campus landscaper. Lewis Pamel was head of the new experiment station and would eventually become a national authority on weeds and poisonous plants. He was also an author and wrote a book for botanists. George was quickly adopted by the liberal thinking botany faculty and naturally became close to its chairman, Pamel. And Pamel State Park happens to be in Madison County. James Wilson was a statesman. He had already served in the Iowa legislature and the U.S. House of Representatives when he was named professor of agriculture at Iowa State in 1891. And he later served as Secretary of Agriculture under Presidents Roosevelt and Taft. Henry C. Wallace, and he's a little older in this picture. I could not find a younger one, but he was just graduating from Iowa State himself at this time. And like all the faculty, he was fond of George and watched out for him and often invited him to his home. Henry C. Wallace had a son, Henry A. Wallace, who was a young boy at that time. And Carver would take Henry A. into the woods. And Henry A. later said that George Carver introduced me to the mysteries of botany and plant fertilization. He deepened my appreciation of plants in a way I could never forget. Almost 30 years after George met him, Henry C. Wallace would become the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture from 1921 to 24, and Henry A. Wallace followed his father into politics and was eventually vice president. And Carver worked with both of the Wallaces later in his career. Some nice friends to have. So before he received his bachelor's degree in 1894, and this is his graduation picture, he was granted a teaching assistantship and admitted to the master's degree program. So not only was he the first Black graduate for Iowa State, but he was also the first Black faculty member. In graduate school, he taught classes in microbiology and botany, and yet served as faculty sponsor for the art club. He just could never leave art. He continued working closely with Pamel since he was again in charge of the greenhouses and was the botany assistant at the Iowa Experiment Station. Here he is a little older as he's getting ready to leave Iowa State. He didn't need to look for a post after earning his master's degree in 1896 because Iowa State and those four men all expected him to remain there as a full-fledged experiment station botanist with a comfortable salary. For 6 years, he'd been the shelter of Iowa State, their prized young genius of a group of men with extraordinary intellects. But his published papers and his lectures around the country had made his name known, and colleges began recruiting him, much to the dismay of the professors mentioned. Here's a picture of an early experiment station. So Carver began receiving job offers, and his perplexed professors were writing him the letters of recommendation he asked, yet stated to the other schools that the salary, the coursework, and the school had better be an improvement over Iowa State Ag College, because none of them believed that they could be, and they hoped that he would stay at Iowa State. Here's a quote from a James Wilson letter, where he both shows his respect for Carver and that he understood that Carver needed to move on. He said, "We have no one to take his place, and I would never part with a student with so much regret as George Carver. I feel he is at home among us, but you call him to go down there and teach the people of his own race, a people I have been taught to respect. I cannot object to his going." Carver was approached by Booker T. Washington with an underwhelming offer of hard work and low wages at Tuskegee College in Alabama, and he hesitated, even though there were several letters from Booker T. asking him to come. They finally met face to face when Washington was in Cedar Rapids. Carver went there along with Professors Pamel and Wilson. Washington's charismatic personality won them all over and set Carver's mind to Tuskegee as a way to help his people. There was a big send-off in Ames, written up in the paper. The faculty and students presented Carver with a superb microscope and case as the going-away present. And they couldn't have imagined that was one of the best pieces of equipment he would have in his laboratory at Tuskegee for the next 45 plus years. Carver kept in contact with his old friends, writing letters to Helen Millholland and Sophia Liston throughout their lives. In 1928, after 48 years from leaving Winterset, George wrote to Mrs. Millholland, who had expressed interest in writing a sketch of his life. He said to her, "You know of my early struggles as but few people do, and in other ways you know me probably as no one else does." He returned to Simpson in 1941 to give the baccalaureate speech, just 18 months before his death. So George Washington Carver was such an unusual individual, gifted with intelligence, along with a caring and inquisitive personality. He stumbled on to Iowa with broken dream, but here he met people and he had opportunities before him that set him on a path to meet his goal of helping his race, which he did, and help the whole world with agricultural endeavors. So that's the end of my presentation. I do want to show you one more slide before we go to discussion. In Indianola, in Warren County, there is a Warren County Historical Society with several interesting buildings and a museum. But there they have recovered the shed they believe that he lived in Indianola, and they built a Morton building around it. And they have a very nice display there of his life at Simpson College and his time in Indianola. And the shed there is in the middle and appointed as they feel that he would have had it during that time. So it's a nice little day trip to Indianola. And now I'm ready for any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. We have time to answer some questions. However, before I pose our first question, I want to remind our participants that you can still submit your questions through our Q&A feature here on Zoom. Now, let's get to the first question, and I like this question. So, Linda, how did you become interested in this topic?
Well, it was Madison County centered a few years ago during October's annual Carvers Speech Festival. Our theme was George Washington Carver. And we had some movies, we had an actor portraying him during the 2 days of the festival. And at the Historical Museum, where I am on the board, we knew there was several pieces of lore out there about George Washington Carver that weren't quite right. So we put a little PowerPoint together for our annual meeting and began explaining what we knew to be the facts about George Washington Carver's time there. And since then, it's expanded out to include Indianola and Ames. So I learned more about his time in Iowa and came to appreciate him more and more.
Now, through your research, did you get a sense of where his determination for an education came from?
Well, I think some he was just born with. He must have been extremely curious, and he was such an unusual child and man that people were just so drawn to his intelligence and his inquisitiveness. So I believe he came to us that way, and he got a lot of strength from nature. He communed with God daily. He would get up at 4 a.m. just to walk in nature and try to answer his questions. And I think he just had an insatiable appetite for knowledge.
And we have a few questions that are about specific times. So this time in Kansas, do you know what was the death he witnessed in Kansas? And how do you think that impacted him?
Yes, most of the sources, and I know you're going to send those out, if you read his biographies, they will talk about that. And it was a young Black man accused of a crime. And I think he was burned, he was hung. It was a horrible death. And George hid during it, but did witness it all. And that was the first time he had really seen that kind of prejudice against Blacks. And it did scar him. And he immediately left Fort Scott and moved on.
Now, one thing I love that your images and photographs in your presentation, they're fantastic. But a question came in of where did you find the photos of the art class at Simpson College?
That's out there, and I actually took that from the display at the Warren County Historical Society. They had two good pictures of his art class, and you'll sometimes see them in books about him too.
Talking about using sources, do you have a favorite source that you came across in your research? Anything you loved?
Boy, they're all good, and I have to admit, when you'll see I have, I think, 5 biographies, I only had to read the first 100 pages of them, so no one be impressed that I read 5 biographies. But they're good, they're different. They're not all accurate. I always start there because I like to see what they have in common and what's different. It was fun to go to Kansas Memory and find a letter about what happened at Highland College. Most of the biographies had guessed at that, but there was someone who was there and knew of that time. So research is the fun part for me, and so they're all good.
And we have some questions specifically about some of your sources. Are George Washington Carver's letters to the Millhollins in Winterset or another location?
They're not in Winterset. We do have letters that a historian wrote back and forth with Carver in the 1915s, 1920s, asking him about his time there. But Millholland's letters aren't there. The quotes I have are mostly from the biographies. And I would suspicion that if they're anywhere, they're probably held at Tuskegee or either at Diamond, Missouri. They both have good archives about his entire life.
And another question, do you know the location of the Lifton home in Indianola?
Yes. Well, darn, I don't remember whether it exists or not. The address is there, but I don't off the top of my head. Again, go visit Warren County Historical Society and they can tell you about that.
I run into the issue a lot too of researching old homes, and addresses always change and things are gone.
Yeah.
I understand completely.
I need to look up and ask them, but I didn't get that done.
So a question about the slide you're currently on. Can you tell us more about the artwork that's featured on the slide?
Yes, I'll start with the park, the smaller picture. This is beside the hotel where he worked. It always was an empty little space, and it's a very pretty, very peaceful place. And along the left wall, as you walked farther down in there, this mural was placed several years ago. It is big. It's 12 feet by 8 feet. Each one of those panels is 4 feet by 4, and each one of someone can do the math here. I think each one of those tiles is 4 inches by 4 inches. And it was a community-wide project involving school children and 4-H and adults who were artists and adults who knew how to weld all this together. And a group worked on the design with artists, and then the students did the individual panels in there. And it's meant to represent him thinking about his future as a young person. And some of his favorite attributes were dreaming, his courage, his service, and friendship of others.
And this will be our last question, and I think it sums up pretty well everything today. But what did you take away from your research of George Washington Carver?
I hope you felt it as I went through that. First, that he was such an unusual person, and he was so recognizable. And he was so unique for someone having the talents, that voice, the inquisitiveness of a young Black person. And then the fact that he drew the right people towards him, and the helpfulness of all the people. Once they recognized how unique he was, they especially helped him to put words to his dream and reach his dream here in Iowa.
It really gives a good definition of Iowa nice.
Yeah, it does. It really
Yeah.
does.
And with that answer, we'll close out the webinar. Thank you again, Linda. It's been fantastic. I think we can all agree this has been a very informative lunch, and I enjoyed learning about George Washington Carver today. Also, thank you to everyone joining us this afternoon. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the coming months. Now, for more information and to register for our future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as our Goldie's Kids Club programming for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Now, thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again Thursday, April 22nd for our next Iowa History 101 webinar. Thank you, everyone.